wasn't too bad, just minor delay. All right, guys. Thank you for your patience. It took me a minute to get here. I am a chauffeur in the mornings. I don't drive Uber, but I drive my family. All right. And then I got here and we were all locked out and I don't have a key. I have keys to almost everything, but not this room. Okay. We're all good now. So we left off talking about a handful of different types of hypersensitivity disorders. And we ended Monday with some TB testing. And this is a more of an older technique. They have gone away from this, but still similar idea as far as injecting a little bit of this purified protein, a PPD, purified protein derivative, that goes under the skin. And it's a potential antigen that if you have TB or you have been exposed and mounted a response, you will see a welt that appears. It is a type 3 or delayed type, or no, sorry. Yeah, type 3. Type 4, sorry. Oh my gosh, type 4 delayed type hypersensitivity reaction, like poison ivy, poison oak, similar sort of idea with that stuff. So this, and I am impressed by this. I'm impressed by all of this cheese, truly. I'm just like, Jesus, look at all of that. Delicious. Chickens, whatever. So there's all sorts of different possibilities for occupational exposures to things, hazards, where we might mount some types of responses. And we can see two examples here. The text goes through and talks about a handful of other things as we think agricultural, maybe archaeology as you're out unearthing ancient remains, and the dust can potentially stimulate some of this as well. There's all sorts of possibilities. So hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and it really kind of just depends on your respective circumstances as far as what you may be handling or exposed to, as far as potentials for things like that to mount. Last time I had the text open, but this seems like it's showing up just fine. Because I don't have it open this time. I don't have time for that nonsense. So this table breaks down some of these hypersensitivity reactions into a quick visual. Again, 4 types. As we described last time, the first 3 types of hypersensitivity reactions are all humoral or antibody-mediated responses, different immunoglobulins, but antibody-mediated. The last type, the delayed hypersensitivity reactions, are a cell-mediated response. Those T cells are the ones that are stimulating these mechanisms. And I posted on Moodle the link to the video that was kind of going through some details of immune response. And I know if you look at that channel, there are some others that fit right within this as well, if you are interested in diving a little deeper. I do recommend reviewing that because I think it puts a lot of this into perspective as we think about antibody response. It talks about dendritic cells and how they start doing the presentation, telling T cells that in turn tell others. But we can expound upon that and think about some other possibilities and some of this stuff as well. So with that, again, the first 3, we're thinking antibody. And so we've got antigens that are stimulating this with the first and the third. These are soluble antigens, something circulating around in our body that causes these responses. And the type 2 is a cell-bound antigen, a different type of interaction, as we showed with this, like the blood transfusion reactions. So you've got antibodies linking up to those red cells, and then that stimulates stuff like complement or others with the antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity right down here. So we do spout off a handful of different examples at the bottom of this. The first one, we think of like allergic reactions, anaphylaxis, hay fever, nut allergies, and other stuff fits into that category. The type 2, as I mentioned, the transfusion reactions, we also went through a little bit of detail talking about hemolytic disease of the newborn, another factor that's potentially on red cells or not, right? And if we get a reaction that way, it can be a very serious disease for that unborn child. The type 3, numerous types of like immune complex situations, disorders, all right? Numerous things fit into this category. We've got some strep. There's all sorts of things that your strep throat potentially could lend to, which is why it's truly very important to try to treat and deal with that so that it, if it has that potential to progress, we don't allow that to happen. There are numerous things fitting in with these type 3s, and the serum sickness fits right in there. I looked into some of this yesterday because I'm like, I should look a little more, and bee stings were right on the list as a potential, and some of the stuff said serum sickness but the bee stings were right in this is flat out serum sickness. Yep. So it might depend on the specific clinician that's like, oh, I've got this book and it says or I have this book that says it's straight up serum sickness, because they're looking stuff up in textbooks, right?
Sure. Well, and at the time there was
not much,
yeah.
Right? So very interesting though to look a little deeper into that. So, and with that said, I know we haven't really hit on serum sickness, but we think about situations like antitoxins or antivenoms. A big one that I think about would be like rattlesnake bites. And if you're bit by a rattlesnake, you need some antivenom immediately, basically. That's really what needs to happen. And this venom is injected into a horse. The horse mounts an immune response and produces antibodies against it. We bleed that horse, collect the serum, purify out the antibodies, and now we've got an antivenom. But it's made in a horse, and that's a potential issue. Serum sickness oftentimes results in some animal. Horses, there are others as well that can be some potentials. Rabbits fit in there too, where they may be making antibodies. It really depends, all right? Some animal could be doing this. Goats are also pretty good for making antibodies. I didn't see anything really pointing to those guys, but I would think there's really no reason why, if you were getting immunoglobulin from them, that you couldn't develop similar things. So there are proteins, more than just this specific antibody, but there are some other proteins that potentially are being inoculated into you. It also could just be the fact that this antibody isn't made by a human, it's made by a horse. So it's got a slightly different signature to it that we could recognize as, well, that's not my antibody, right? And it mounts a response against that. And that's serum sickness, where we start responding to this foreign substance that really, for the most part, was used to help with other things. But there are other possibilities like bee stings and other circumstances with some infections that can stimulate serum sickness. I also was seeing stuff like Benadryl and other things, ibuprofen, handfuls of drugs that you wouldn't really bat an eye at. They have some potentials where they may cause some ill effects. Pretty rare, I would think, for those circumstances. So it's hard to say. And, it's something that also, in those circumstances with serum sickness, whatever result it's from, you need to avoid that stuff. So no more passive antibody or avoiding bee stings like the plague, I would be thinking, right? So pretty interesting stuff. And then lastly, the type 4, again, cell-mediated stuff, the poison ivy, contact dermatitis, And then we think about some other autoimmune situations that can fit within this category as well. Type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis are in this type 4 category. Lupus and some others we can see in other types of hypersensitivity reactions, but typically it's these two that we're thinking about as possibilities. And there are all sorts of speculations. I mentioned the hygiene hypothesis and thinking about stuff, some of it potentially alleviating some issues, some allergies or anaphylaxis. And then we think about some of these other possibilities with autoimmune disorders that are probably higher up on the list. All right. I'm going to spout off just the littlest bit with this. I mentioned the individual that got himself some hookworms. He ultimately harvests and sells that stuff to people. If you are so inclined, you can look up hookworm therapy and he will pop up. You can see that stuff. All right. But as we think about all of these potentials, many people are pretty stinking grossed out by the thought of deliberately or even unintentionally getting themselves some worms. All right. Unintentionally might be a little better to deal with, but the fact that you deliberately inoculated yourself with some of these worms kind of grosses quite a few people out. I think if I was battling MS or something else, that'd be on the table. And I would think, could this be a possibility? All right. There are all sorts of substances, just like we've been talking about, all sorts of cytokines and antigens and antibodies and all sorts of these molecular things floating around in your body, things that we may respond to or potentially secrete out as a defensive mechanism. All right. We talked about stuff like the PAMPs, these markers on bacterial cells, little fingerprints, if you will, that can stimulate some stuff. Parasites have similar things. We don't call them PAMPs, but they've got all sorts of different antigens potentially shown to their surface. They also can do some crazy stuff, and they can show some stuff on the outside and stimulate our immune response. And just as we start producing antibody to target, they stop producing that and they produce something different. We call that antigenic variation, and it's a way to evade the immune response. All right. Some of these worms do some secretory protein stuff that they're putting out to the outside, and those things are antigenic. And the thought, there's research that's being poured into this right now. The thought is, wouldn't it be nicer to just take a pill that's got some of the substance, but not the actual worm? I bet you most people be on board with that. All right. You're not infecting yourself. You're not giving yourself worms. You're just taking a fragment of that ultimately stimulates the response. Done deal. All right. I think that's pretty fascinating. And like I said, I bet for those that are like, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't give myself worms, I bet you'd take the protein that they're making if given the choice. So this, we could go back to our type 1 response, these allergic reactions as we're looking at this, and that's what we're saying right here. I mentioned that guy that got himself hookworms. He had some allergy testing done to determine what's up. I mean, he's obviously super allergic to bee stings, but they wanted to know other stuff. And so they do a skin prick test, allergy testing, basically to see numerous types of allergens, these antigens inoculated under the skin and given the body a little bit of time to potentially respond. You may see these welts, these wheals and flares raised up and redness as a result. And that's what we've got over here. All right. A lot of it, I'm like, well, that looks like it's all irritated, right? But this is really just where it's been inoculated under the skin. You get a little bleb if it gets inflamed. If we were to zoom in on this, this kind of looks blistered. Like it's nothing like the, flip it back to the poison ivy. Where's that? It's probably too far back. Oh, did I miss it? Right there. right? That's a serious one, right? And you potentially might be seeing something kind of like that as it's emerging. There are potentials. Once we recognize some of this stuff and you know you're allergic to grass or you're allergic to, you know, specific allergens. We showed all of those different pollen grains, right? There's all sorts of different plants that start releasing pollen at different times in the spring into the summer. And they oftentimes will spout off some of these certain things, like ragweed is a good one. And that happens pretty early on, and they know, and here it is. And if you start getting these issues, well, maybe you know this is what's up. You could get tested, and then maybe you know these are specific things I ought to be avoiding. There are other potentials with this, not this type of testing, but there are desensitizations where you know you're allergic to something, and you get little bits. Little stimuli, not a massive amount. You don't need a huge peanut butter and jelly sandwich, little bits, all right? And that potentially over the course of time makes it so your system doesn't see these things as being foreign like they are in the allergic response. And it's basically goes away, downregulates it, all right? There are definitely things we could think about what we might do without even knowing. I mentioned the peanut butter and jelly, but not jelly. If we did a peanut butter and honey sandwich and the honey was collected locally, these bees have been tapping into all sorts of things, and you potentially are picking up some of the pollen that maybe is stimulating your response, giving you some of that hay fever. And so eating some peanut butter and honey sandwiches with local honey is like a desensitizer over the course of time, and it may alleviate some of the hay fever symptoms. I think that's pretty interesting, all right? So moving on and thinking about some of the disorders, there are numerous things as we move through here. So we can see a goiter. We're going to see another image with Graves' disease as well, because there's more than just this. So hypertrophy of the thyroid is one of the symptoms of Graves' disease and Hashimoto thyroiditis. This is another exophthalmia. You can see like the bulging eyes. I kind of wish we had a profile better than a head on. That looks like she's just seen probably a ghost, right? But like I said, I'd like to see that because they truly do kind of bulge out. Both of these are symptoms, signs of Graves. Addison's disease, as we can see here, some hyperpigmentation. This, I want to say it has to do with the adrenals. Adrenals. So body kills off that. So it's another autoimmune for, in all of these circumstances, we start targeting something. So targeting the thyroid, targeting the adrenals, and basically wiping them out. Now, you've got, I think you're pretty super lethargic, right? Very tired.
If you don't treat with a couple different kinds of steroids, you die.
You die.
Yeah, within days. It's,
awesome.
oh yeah, President Kennedy had it.
President Kennedy did have this. He had all sorts of
And
different
when you get
treatments.
stressful situations, you have to boost your doses of prednisone and fludrocortisone is the other one. Those are the two medications you have to take.
Okay.
I had a dog that had it.
Ah. So I heard a little bit about Kennedy and his stuff, and he needed treatments, he needed stuff, and it makes you super tired from, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a doctor that was helping and treating him with things, and he was giving him amphetamines, not meth. Little bit different, same but different, right? Shots of amphetamine, all right? And he feels fantastic, right? He could do all sorts of things. And all sorts of other people catch wind of this, and this doctor becomes the doctor of the stars and giving them all of these things. And he, in turn, they call him Dr. Feelgood. There's a song about it. That's what it's all about. And I'm like, what in the hell? That's for real. It truly is, right? I like it, all right?
Back when they were dispensing Valium like.
Oh, yeah,
candy.
like candy. Yeah, here,
Right.
take some of these, you know. Is that Mother's Little Helper? I think it is, right? Crazy, all right? There were all sorts of things, and we could go even farther back. You know, I've seen some stuff that's talking like grandparents or great grandparents, and they're like, oh, you know, back in my day and this and that and whatever. There were all sorts of things like treating stuff. Heroin was something we would use. Your child has colic, it cries and whatever, rub a little of this heroin in their mouth. That will help them sleep. And it sure did, right? Crazy, all right? We think a little differently about that stuff today, thankfully, all right? Crazy. All right, so this, seeing this pigmentation could be an indication of that. Myasthenia gravis, this is basically impacting muscle contraction. So we get antibodies. Here we've got receptors that should be coming in, the acetylcholine release and stimulating these cells for contraction. I said antibodies, but here's the antibodies. The antibodies link up and basically block this, preventing it from interacting, for the most part, interacting with those receptors, causing paralysis of those cells, all right? So autoantibodies blocking those receptors and basically causing that. So numerous potentials. Here we can see rheumatoid arthritis. The x-ray, as I look at this, I'm just like, oh my gosh. And it's gotta be super painful. It's gotta be. All sorts of contortions with this, right? And you know, as you look at this, you're like, oh, he's bending his hands like this for the image, but no, that's how they just are, right? Kind of crazy. My wife had her great grandma that, I mean, most people probably don't say they know their great grandparents. She was fortunate to have a very good relationship with her. As she was in her very late 90s, she had some serious rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, it was real. You could see stuff in her 80s that her hands were starting to contort. But a decade later, they were more like this and super debilitated. Can't really do much when your hands don't function anymore. Pretty crazy. All right, lupus, there are, and we can see here some characteristics with it. They say kind of a butterfly shaped rash that is often times apparent. With this, it's an autoimmunity to your own DNA or proteins. You start targeting all sorts of things, and we can see issues besides the rash. That's really rather superficial. It's the other stuff that's the bigger problem. All sorts of issues. And as we showed in that table, lupus fit within that type 3. So some of these complexes that we start targeting. And so it impacts circulation, causes inflammation, muscle pain, all sorts of other problems. Maybe the first hint could be seeing this rash, and then you recognize other things going on. Kind of just depends. I think we're about at the end of this. I felt so rushed as I rolled in here late that I just talked super fast. That's perfect because that's what you were hoping for. All right, David Better was our bubble boy. He was born basically without an immune response, right? Doesn't have the T cells needed to basically govern immune reactions, all right? So SCID is severe combined immunodeficiency. It is it's like HIV, but HIV is acquired, and this is something that you are born with, all right? It's not the same, but similar, all right, as far as how we see some of the manifestations. So basically, as he was born, they recognized he had issues and put him into basically a sterile environment, lived in a bubble with little like glove, you know, you could put your hands into these gloves, you could hug him that way, you could interact the littlest bit, but you didn't actually make physical contact with him because simply that was enough to make him sick and die, all right? So he lived in this bubble with the hopes that medicine would find a cure and they would be able to help him fix his problems, but that wasn't the case, all right? In this image, I don't know exactly how old he was, maybe 8 or 9. Right here, he looks about that old. NASA generously built him a spacesuit that gave him the ability to actually be outside of his bubble the littlest bit. He's still in a bubble, right? But he's not trapped in this tent, right? Gave him the opportunity to kind of do a little bit of stuff. So he lived till he was 12. And I assume lots of counseling with him and with his parents. They recognized there's really no cure in sight. It doesn't seem like there's any hope. And I think there were lots of frustrations. He decided he didn't want to live like this anymore. And he crawled out of the bubble, got sick, and died. Truly a pretty sad story. We're ending this class on a high note. So shortly after David passed away with genetic engineering, we were able to cure a few people with SCID. Before they were ever born, we were able to go in and manipulate their genes. And when they were born, they had a competent immune response. We also killed a few children in the process of doing this. And that put the brakes on a lot of the using gene therapies for curing. And now we start thinking about using stuff like this as treatments, not as cures, not trying to target the specific stem cells as we'd be thinking about here, and potentially causing issues, taking out the cells and putting in the proper gene into those cells, cultivating them in a lab, injecting them back into you. It's your own stuff, but corrected. Now they have an immune response. And there are a couple of other genetic disorders that we think about therapies with, where we do similar things, but not curing, all right? At least not right now, all right? There are all sorts of potentials. And with the discovery of the CRISPR-Cas gene editing mechanism, which I think is fascinating, that opens up all sorts of other potentials when we think about biotechnology and genetic engineering. It opens up avenues for things that also potentially could be a bit disturbing, with things like designer babies and, you know, putting specific traits or characteristics into this unborn child that suits your fancy, all right? We're not breeding dogs here, folks, but it seems kind of like that's what's sort of happening, right? Is that good? Is it bad? I bet I see some posts on Packback about that. All right, guys. I hope you all have a great spring break. No lecture Friday. Test opens in an hour, in 30 minutes, I think. Questions or concerns? Anybody from home? Concerns? I thought not. Okay, guys. Farewell. Have a great break.